The movie starts off in the summer of 1986 in New Jersey, where a 16-year-old boy named Brian David excitedly calls his crush, Melody, at her job. Unable to contain his excitement, he orders some food whilst flirting with her incessantly. After a short banter, Brian introduces himself and asks her how she's been doing. Melody immediately recognizes him and replies that she's doing well. It turns out that the two last met about a year ago, where they made out in her pool. Sadly, Brian was too scared to go any further, so their hangout was cut short. At present, Brian reminds Melody of their awkward date. He tells her that he wanted her to think he was a nice guy, which is why he refused to go to second base. Melody laughs upon hearing this and exclaims that she waited for Brian's calls after that, but it never came. Anxious, Brian explains that he thought she started disliking him after their date, so he never had the guts to call her. Finally, after a year, he had mustered up the courage to do so. After his long explanation, Brian cautiously asks Melody if she's willing to go on another date with him. Nervous, he asks her out on a movie date. Melody readily agrees, causing Brian to jump up and down out of excitement. After a short celebration, Brian asks Melody if she'd like to watch any movie in particular. Melody simply tells Brian that she doesn't have a specific wish, so Brian decides to take her to watch the 4:30 show of Bucklick, an R-rated detective comedy based on her mother's favorite book series. The two continue to chat for quite a while before hanging up and going back to their errands. After hanging up, Brian cheers in excitement and immediately runs out of the house. He takes his bike and goes for a ride. During this time, he purchases a magazine and then heads towards the ice cream parlor where he works. There, he cheerfully greets his coworker, Cookie. Cookie asks Brian if he has got a shift that day, to which he replies that he doesn't. Excited, he tells Cookie that he's actually going on a movie date with his crush. Upon hearing this, Cookie mocks Brian for being such a movie geek and then wishes him all the best for his date. Shortly after, Brian goes to sit at the pier to record his thoughts in a tape recorder. He does so in order to record all his important thoughts he has since he wants to be a writer one day. Later, Brian goes to his best friend, Belly's house, where he sees Belly's mother making bacon for them. When Brian asks her about it, she replies that the bacon is for them to take to the movies. Concerned, she explains that since they are growing boys, they should stay away from snacks like popcorn and sweets. Brian just shrugs at that and continues munching on the bacon. Just then, Belly walks up to Brian and they joke around for a while. At that moment, a very nervous Belly wonders aloud if they should really watch Bucklick. He explains that since the movie is rated R, they aren't allowed to watch it. If found, they would be banned from life from the theaters. In response, Brian assures Belly by saying that they're slick, so they would never get caught. Brian also tells Belly that he finally asked Melody out to watch the movie with them. As expected, Belly is excited to hear this and congratulates him for securing a date with such a pretty girl. Moments later, the two boys head over to their other friend, Bernie's house. Bernie happens to be an obnoxious teen who brags about how many other girls he's hooked up with. So, when he learns that Brian asked Melody out, he just laughs, claiming that she's younger than them. Brian tries to defend himself and says that he really loves Melody. However, Bernie simply snickers and says Melody is perfect for him since they're both really short. He then starts talking about how he's a ladies' man who can get any girl he wants. After his rant, he asks Brian not to date Melody since she's flat-chested and dumb. Brian is offended by this, so he retorts by saying that Melody loves his humor and the two of them really get along. Not wanting to argue any longer, Brian changes the topic to Major Murder, a fictional character that both Belly and Bernie are obsessed with. All three of them wrestle for a while, and finally, get into Bernie's pickup truck. During their ride, they fool around and sing along to some pop music. When they finally reach the theater, they decide to spend the entire day at the movies, with Melody set to join them for the 4:30 showing of Bucklick. The boys thus plan to watch a film called Astro Blaster and the Beaver Men, a cheesy space opera starring a beaver warrior, Damocles, joining forces with the hero, Astro Blaster. They stand in line for their tickets, mocking their classmates and teasing each other whilst doing so. Right at that moment, Mike, the theater's egotistical manager, arrives at the scene in his modified Batmobile. All three boys suddenly get quiet and start behaving since Mike is notorious for banning people from the theater for life. Mike looks at them carefully before welcoming them into the cinemas. After Mike walks away, Brian tells Belly and Bernie that they have to purchase tickets for 2 R-rated movies, so they'll have to be extremely cautious. Brian and Belly easily secure their tickets, whereas Bernie starts flirting with the ticket agent. Thankfully, the ticket agent just ignores him and hands him the ticket for Astro Blaster. Later, Brian and Bernie head towards the theater to secure their seats. On the other hand, Belly gets online to buy some snacks. There he meets a young but annoying boy who tells him that he can't hold spots for his friends when they get back. Belly just laughs at him, asserting that he can do what he wants. That's when the boy goes to his father and falsely accuses Belly of flashing him. As expected, the man is infuriated and demands Belly be kicked out of the cinemas. Back in the theater, Brian begs Bernie not to mess with Mike, but Bernie doesn't listen. Instead, he teases Mike for his behavior, ultimately causing Mike to keep a close eye on them. Noticing this, Brian berates Bernie for trying to act smart. He begs Bernie to just sit down and wait until Belly gets back. However, when Belly doesn't return even after a long while, the two go to the concession stand to look for him. That's when they see Belly standing outside the cinema, angrily banging on the door. Shocked, Brian asks him what happened. Just when Belly is about to reply, Mike comes up from behind them and accuses Belly of being a pervert. Enraged, he asks Brian and Bernie if they're friends with Belly. Not wanting to get kicked out, they lie stating that Belly is just their classmate. However, as Mike leaves, Bernie goes up to Belly and suggests they meet out back. The two run towards the back door where Bernie quietly sneaks Belly in. Belly thanks Bernie for the help. Bernie, however, blackmails him into handing the snack bacon in order to get in. Belly grimaces, gives the packet of bacon to Bernie, and then runs into the hall as soon as possible. In the meantime, Brian returns back to the line and meets a friend of his. The two talk for quite a while, and at one point, Brian gets really annoyed. He just continues nodding while waiting for Bernie and Belly to get back. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, the movie starts. Bernie, Belly, and Brian immediately get to their seats with all their snacks in hand. They express their excitement about the movie and joke around together. Soon they start watching the trailers and talk about what movie they're going to watch next. The first trailer is for the film called Sister Sugar Walls, which is about a titular nun who acts as a prostitute to provide for the orphans she looks after, while also punishing the ones who hurt them. The next trailer is for a horror film called The Health Nut, followed by a creature feature called Booties, where a monster brutally slays a construction worker. Shortly after, the actual movie starts and all three boys begin watching it eagerly. Right at that moment, a bunch of senior girls walk into the theater. It turns out that the girls are Bernie's brother's friends. The girls sit right in front of Bernie, causing him to recognize them instantly. So he quickly takes this opportunity to talk to one of the girls, Jessica. He starts flirting with her and asks her if she has a boyfriend. Jessica replies that she doesn't, and flirts with him as well. Their conversation really irks Brian, so he asks them to shut up. However, Bernie doesn't give up. With a smug face, he asks if she'd like to make out with him in the back of the theater. Jessica readily agrees, and the two of them run out of their seats. Just then, the movie usher walks in and calls out for Brian, stating that there's an emergency. Brian is shocked by this and thinks he's in trouble. He tries to hide in his seat with Belly, not wanting to get caught. However, after multiple calls from the usher, Brian cautiously walks towards her and out the theater. Once outside, Brian looks around and nervously walks over to Mike. He asks what happened, to which Mike replies there's an emergency call from his mother. Mike angrily hands the phone to Brian and tells him to speak quietly. Brian nods, takes the phone, and asks his mother what the emergency is. Much to his dismay, she berates him for not keeping his cat clean and insists he give it a bath that night. Brian groans at his mother's complaint and tries to end the call. Mike even walks up to him demanding the phone back. However, Brian's mom refuses to hang up, continuously holding him up. Finally, Mike threatens to kick him out, so Brian hurriedly ends the call and hands the phone back. After getting his phone back, Mike mocks Brian for bringing his family issues to the cinema and warns him not to repeat it again. Just then, Mike gets another call, and unsurprisingly, it's Brian's mom again. Mike just groans and hands the phone back to Brian. Now frustrated, Brian takes the phone and angrily asks his mother why she keeps bothering him. That's when his mother expresses that she wants him to say, "I love you" to her, just in case something happens to him while riding back home. She even drags his dad into the argument and refuses to let him get back to watch the movie. Brian begs his mom to just let him be. Before he can say anything more, Mike walks up to him again and glares at him to give the phone back. Eventually, after what seems like an eternity, Brian hangs up the call and goes back into the theater hall. He sits next to Bernie and tries to talk to him. However, when he doesn't get any response, he worriedly looks at Bernie, only to see him making love to Jessica. Disgusted, he runs out of the seat and goes to sit next to Belly. There, he starts venting about Bernie hooking up with Jessica while watching the movie. A while later, he turns to look at Belly, who appears to be sound asleep. Because of this, Brian decides to simply ignore everyone and continue watching the movie. But his dreams are crushed once again by the movie usher, who calls him back since he's getting yet another phone call. Confused, Brian follows her, only to see Mike standing in front of him. Enraged, Mike yells at Brian for the excessive amounts of phone calls and warns him that this is the last phone call he will be able to receive. Brian nods nervously and takes the phone, only to learn that this time, it's Melody calling him to inform him that she won't be able to make it to the 4:30 movie. Brian starts panicking, thinking his date with Melody would end up getting canceled. Worried, he suggests they go to the 7:15 show instead. Melody happily agrees and tells him that she'll be there at 7. With that, Brian cuts the call and returns back to watch the movie. There, Bernie teases him for getting endless calls and even mocks him for being a mama's boy. Brian clarifies by saying that this time, it was Melody who informed him that she'd come to the movies a little later. As expected, Bernie groans upon hearing this. He asks if they'd be seeing the 7:15 Bucklick show. Brian replies that they are, and begs Bernie to just go along with the plan. However, Bernie isn't happy with changing their schedule again and again over a random girl. Towards the end of the movie, Brian wakes Belly up so that he can hide in the bathrooms in time. If Mike ended up catching him, they'd be all banned for life. So Bernie and Brian frantically wake Belly up and ask him to hide in the bathroom by the time the movie ends. Belly agrees to do so and sneaks into the washroom in a way no one would see. He sits on one of the toilets quietly while munching on some bacon. But that's when he sees inappropriate graffiti on the wall. Turned on by it, he unzips his pants and proceeds to pleasure himself. Back in the theater, the movie ends, so Bernie and Brian proceed to leave. They walk towards the concession lines to get some snacks. At that moment, an infuriated Mike drags Belly out of the bathroom, yelling at him for pleasuring himself in a public bathroom. Brian and Bernie immediately hide upon seeing him. They watch as Mike ruthlessly kicks Belly out of the cinema, banning him for life. After he leaves, Bernie goes back to Belly and asks him to come to the back door again. Belly nods and immediately runs to the back. In the meantime, Brian decides to watch another R-rated movie. But just as he's about to enter the hall, the movie usher spots him and asks him to leave since he clearly looks underage. Not knowing what to do, Brian starts to distract the usher, asking him if working in the cinemas is fun. However, the usher, who happens to be an emo punk, starts complaining about society and the state of the films they are showing. Not just that, he also talks about how Americans are just dumb who love stupid movies. While he's ranting, Brian sees Bernie and Belly hiding around the corner, so he continues distracting the movie usher until the two manage to sneak into the theater. Brian then tries to leave, but the usher keeps talking and insulting every single thing known to mankind. Moments later, Bernie and Belly come out to look for Brian. But before they can go into the hall, Mike comes along, so they run out of the place as soon as possible. Brian also takes this opportunity to walk away, since he doesn't want to deal with the obnoxious manager. He then runs towards Bernie and Belly to ask them why they came out. Bernie replies that the theater is fully packed, so there are no seats left for them. He then insults Brian for ruining their movie schedule because of Melody. As expected, the two get into a heated argument. Just then, a group of small girls walk towards Bernie and berate him for swearing. Bernie, however, isn't fazed by them, so he asks them to run along. This causes the girls to attack Bernie, which eventually leads to Mike finding out and kicking all three of them out of the theater. Not just that, Mike also bans all three of them for life, causing Bernie to scream erratically and run away. Brian and Belly run after him to fix things, knowing that Melody will be arriving soon. Brian yells at Bernie, saying their plan is ruined because of him. Bernie, however, retorts that it's all because of Melody, as Brian changed their entire schedule for her. Bernie continues blaming Brian for getting Melody involved while Brian just keeps on defending her. The argument soon escalates into a fistfight with Bernie and Brian punching the air out of each other. Thankfully, Belly breaks the fight just in time. He also ends up figuring out the main issue here. He explains that Bernie is threatened by Brian and Melody's relationship, while Brian is too concerned with seeking Bernie's approval. He also adds that Bernie is just worried Brian might prioritize Melody over him and spend all his time with her. Finally, after a long rant, Belly demands the two reconcile and go back to being friends again. Brian realizes his mistake and agrees with Belly. He apologizes to Bernie and asks if they can be friends again. However, Bernie refuses to do so. He just flips them off and storms away. Brian, hurt and upset, goes to a nearby diner and proceeds to get lunch alone. Meanwhile, Bernie sits at a park to reflect on all that has happened so far. However, that's when he spots his idol, Major Murder. Now excited, he runs to Major Murder and exclaims that he's a really big fan. In response, Major Murder drops his manly voice and thanks Bernie for the support. He adds that he's there to meet his wife before the next big match. Bernie is confused by this, since Major Murder's wife looks a lot younger than him. However, that's when he clarifies that the two actually went to high school together. It's just that she was a year younger than him. Major Murder further explains that his own friends made fun of him for dating her since she was younger than him, but he got over his insecurities to become who he is now. He tells Bernie that she always had his back even when being bullied for being overweight as a child, which is why he loves her so much. Hearing all this, Bernie just nods, unable to process anything. But as they go on talking, Bernie realizes that the tough manly personality is just for show, and the real Major Murder, whose name happens to be Albert, is just a normal guy with a small and happy family. Instead of being disappointed, Bernie is inspired by Albert, and his whole point of view changes. In the meantime, Brian sits behind the cinema, waiting for a miracle to happen. That's when he gets spotted by the pretty movie usher, who asks him what he's doing there. In response, Brian tells her that he's just mourning his life since it's practically over. With a dramatic tone, he tells her that he loves movies and doesn't know what to do anymore. Hearing this, the movie usher tells him that she, too, loves movies. The two quickly bond over their love for films, with the usher informing Brian that she's moving to Rhode Island to attend film school, as she also wants to be a director. Brian is deeply impressed with her ambitions and wishes her all the best. The movie usher just smiles at that, and tells him that she sees the same ambition in him, adding that their love for film is the first step towards becoming a successful filmmaker. Needless to say, Brian is inspired, so he decides to make his own movie. Feeling courageous, Brian walks to the front of the cinema, where he sees Melody approaching him. He instantly blushes upon seeing her, but manages to muster the courage to greet her. The two talk for quite a while, and Brian tells Melody that she looks absolutely beautiful. She blushes, thanks him, and then proceeds to walk into the theater. That's when Brian stops her, informing her that he's banned from the theater. However, he quickly comes up with an idea. Brian and Melody nervously walk into the theater, only to see Mike standing right before them. With a deep sigh, Brian approaches Mike and begs him to lift the ban, explaining that he wants to watch a movie with the girl he loves, and even offers to work there for free if he's allowed to watch Bucklick one last time. Despite his pleas, Mike dismisses him and refuses to lift the ban. Seeing this, Melody angrily confronts Mike, calling him out for his ignorance. She accuses him of being an asshole and a loser who blames others for his shortcomings. Offended, Mike angrily bans Melody too and laughs in her face. However, his satisfaction is short-lived when a furious Bernie arrives in his pickup truck and hits Mike's prized Batmobile. Mike runs towards his car, wailing loudly. This causes a big enough distraction for Brian, Melody, and Belly to sneak in to see Bucklick. Feeling grateful, Brian smiles at Bernie for his sacrifice and runs into the theater with Melody. Once inside, they distract the usher and quickly grab their seats. Brian praises Melody for her bravery, agreeing that Mike deserved the insults. Just as they're getting comfortable, however, they are confronted by Melody's mother. Now furious, her mother scolds her for trying to watch an R-rated movie. During their argument, Melody learns that her mom had gone to see Poltergeist 2 with her aunt, despite the two of them planning to watch it together. Enraged, Melody storms out of the theater with Brian. After exiting the cinema hall, Brian and Melody decide to go on a walk where Melody complains about how her mom treats her like a baby. She then says that since she's in trouble anyway, she wants to enjoy the rest of the day as much as she can. Brian nods in excitement, and the two run towards a nearby bridge. There they chat about their lives and goals. They even talk about their relationship up until now. Finally, Brian musters up the courage to tell Melody how he really feels. He gets on one knee and asks her out, claiming that he really likes her and sees a future with her. Initially, Melody tells him that she isn't sure about it, but after a while of thinking, she asserts that he's the most interesting guy she's ever met. However, she adds that after they made out and almost made it to second base last summer, Brian never contacted her again. With a deep sigh, Melody explains that she doesn't want to get abandoned again. In response, Brian tells her that even though he never contacted her, he thought about her for a whole year. Sadly, Melody doesn't believe him, so Brian pulls out his tape recorder and makes her listen to all the times he's talked about her, or just how much he loves her. Touched, Melody smiles and accepts his proposal. Finally, the two kiss passionately and move forward with their relationship. Shortly after, Brian asks if they're boyfriend and girlfriend now, to which Melody replies that they are. Brian then says that if their life was a movie, it would be fitting that they end up together. Melody just laughs and walks away with him, hand in hand. In the end, Melody, Bernie, and Belly sit together and help Brian muster up the courage to apply for a job he so desperately wants. Melody assures him that he'll be really good at his job and asks him to wrap it up as soon as possible so that they can get lunch. It is finally revealed that the store is none other than the Quick Stop grocery store. However, Brian looks at the store and tells the three it can wait.